All right, let's get into it. We're going to travel back in time about 200 years ago to look at some huge social shifts that totally changed the game in India. We're talking about the lives of women, the caste system, and some incredible reforms that really challenged old traditions. But before we jump into all the history, I want you to just think about something for a second. What do you think life was really like for a girl your age 2 centuries ago? Seriously, it's a world that is almost impossible to imagine from where we're standing today. And the difference is, well, it's just staggering. 200 years ago, a girl could be married off while she was still a child, with zero say in the matter. Education? Nope, not a right, not even really an option for most. Inheriting property? Forget about it. And voting? Not a chance. Now you look at today. The minimum age for marriage is 18. Education is a fundamental right. Women can own property, they can vote, they can even run for office. No, this was the result of a long and incredibly difficult fight. And that brings us to our first big topic, the struggle for women's rights and the push to change practices that had been around for centuries. I mean, the challenges were just enormous. Child marriage was everywhere. Men could have several wives, which is called polygamy. Women couldn't inherit their family's property, and they were almost completely shut out from getting an education. But maybe the most shocking and brutal custom of all was something called sati. Let's focus on sati for a moment because it was a truly devastating practice. It was held up as this noble sacrifice, the ultimate act of a devoted wife. But the reality was often cruel and horrifying. So what exactly was it? Sati was a custom where a widow was expected to burn herself to death on her husband's funeral pyre. And while the sources say it was sometimes voluntary, the truth is women were often forced, sometimes even tied down so they couldn't escape the flames. And the craziest part? Society praised this as a virtuous thing to do, which made it so hard to fight against. But people did fight back. The campaign to end sati was one of the first really big reform movements. In the early 1800s, a reformer named Raja Ram Mohan Roy launched this powerful campaign against it. And his strategy? It was absolutely brilliant. He used ancient religious texts to prove that sati wasn't actually required by the religion at all. By the 1820s, he had gotten British officials on his side, who also thought it was barbaric. And finally, in 1829, the government officially banned the practice, a huge step forward. So, banning sati was a massive victory. But it opened up another really important question. What happened to the widows who survived? Their lives were still incredibly hard. They were often treated like outcasts, forced to live alone, and completely forbidden from ever marrying again. And this is where another amazing reformer, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, steps in. He basically took a page out of Raja Ram Mohan Roy's playbook. He dove into the same ancient texts that his opponents used and found passages that suggested widows could remarry. He was using their own rulebook against them to tear down their arguments. And you know what? It worked. Because of all his hard work, British officials passed a law in 1856 that allowed widows to remarry. But here's the thing. Passing a law is one thing, but changing people's minds is a whole other battle. Vidyasagar faced a ton of backlash from conservative groups who thought he was destroying tradition. All of these fights for basic rights really pointed to one thing: education. Reformers started to realize that for any of this change to actually stick, women needed to be empowered, and the key to that empowerment was education. But back then, just the idea of teaching a girl to read and write, well, it was seen as completely revolutionary, and to some people, totally dangerous. You won't believe some of the arguments people made against educating girls. They said it would pull them away from their household chores. They argued that if a girl walked through a public place to get to school, she'd be corrupted. The biggest fear was that an educated woman would stop caring about her home and her family. It sounds wild to us now, right? But here's where the story gets really incredible. As soon as those doors to education started to creak open, even just a tiny bit, a powerful chain reaction began. The first women who got an education, often taught at home by their forward-thinking fathers or husbands, didn't just keep it to themselves. They started writing, opening schools, and fighting for other women. They became the new champions of reform. Okay, so while this whole fight for women's rights was gaining steam, another massive social battle was being fought right alongside it. And this one was all about challenging the super rigid and unfair caste system, which was the other huge barrier in 19th century India. Society was basically structured like a pyramid. At the very top, you had the Brahmins, the priests and scholars. Right below them were the Kshatriyas, the warriors. Then came the Vaishyas, the traders, and then the Shudras, who were laborers that served the other three. But way, way at the bottom was a group of people considered untouchable. They were forced to do jobs considered polluting, and they faced the absolute worst kind of discrimination. But people didn't just accept this. Reformers and new organizations like the Prarthana Samaj started to challenge this whole system. They argued for the spiritual equality of all people, no matter their caste. They attacked the very idea that your birth decides your value in life. So, we've talked about all this amazing change, but who were the actual people on the ground making it happen? Let's take a quick look at some of the key players who were forging this new path forward. This table is like a hall of fame of reformers. You've got Raja Ram Mohan Roy, who founded the Brahmo Samaj and fought to end sati. Of course, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, the hero of widow remarriage. Dayanand Saraswati and his Arya Samaj pushed for both widow remarriage and education for girls. And then you have these powerhouse women reformers, like Pandita Ramabai, who wrote about the tough lives of women and opened a home for widows, and Jyotirao Phule, who started some of the very first schools for girls. Every single one of them was a trailblazer. And that brings us to maybe the biggest lesson from this whole era. Passing laws to ban sati or allow widows to remarry, that was a huge, essential first step. But the real challenge, the much harder, longer battle, wasn't changing the laws. It was changing what people believed in their hearts and minds. So that leaves us with one final thought. This fight for equality, for women against caste discrimination, it all started over 200 years ago. And these reformers, they accomplished incredible things. But when you look at the world around you today, is that fight really over? That's something for all of us to think about.